Okay, we'll get started. Thanks everyone for joining and happy International Archives Day. Um, just going to run through a set of things before I hand off to Liz and our amazing set of speakers for the day. My name is Venkat. I'm part of the team at the Milli Archives Foundation, which is if you've not heard of it before, is a nonprofit network of archives and archivists broadly dedicated to building, nurturing, and sustaining archives across India. And you can check the website out at milli.link. The Milli Sessions are a set of experiments in public engagement and awareness about archives that we've been running since 2020. And we've had the pleasure of inviting and hosting a variety of people from around the world. And it's really nice to see, again, people from across many different continents joining us today here. So thanks to all of you for joining. You can check out all the previous Milli sessions through the website. They're all free and open to the public. Before I get into this, I also want to say that every year, the Milli Archives Foundation tries to put something out to the public just as an open access tool or resources and such, which is largely its main work. And so we're delighted that there is a network of Milli members, institutions, organizations, archives across the country who have been working over the last year to on a very simple problem, which is how do you measure and improve the quality of an archive? And so this is a three-part project, and we're delighted to be able to launch the first phase of it today. When I say launch, we're just going to share in a website for you to check out, and we'll send details about that later. And this is what we call an archives health tool. And the idea over the next few years is for archives across the country to self-evaluate along a set of parameters and work towards a benchmarking model that allows them to strengthen their work on any area of their choice. And this first phase is effectively a survey of archives in India, both from perspectives of the users and the builders and custodians of archives. And they're very long surveys, but they're quite useful, is what we've heard from people who have tested them, refined them. And so thanks to so many of you who have joined the audience today, because you've all been beta testers for this project. We'll share a link to this in a moment. I just want to give a shout out to all the research assistants who've been involved in this project, Daya, Neetu, Shreyasi, Alolika, and of course, Jaya for leading this project over the last many years. And of course, most importantly, the member network, which has been steering these ideas in the last 2 years or so. I will share the link in the chat. Okay, that's the link to the archive health tool. So please do feel free to give it a spin if you have an archive, you're building an archive, or you're a user of an archive. Help figure out how to strengthen archives in the country. This session today, we're absolutely delighted to have a set of panelists from around the world on what we call, networks of archives and histories of networks. And it's broadly to explore these networks of our archives around the world and how they came to be and what they're imagining as we go forward. I will not be taking more time to explain the session because that's something it's my pleasure to introduce to you Liz Stainforth, who's an associate professor at the University of Leeds, who has kindly agreed to also moderate this session. So Liz's work is something that focuses on the intersections of digital heritage, memory cultures, and the critical studies of history. Her work has examined how digital technologies shape the preservation, interpretation, and governance of cultural memory and historical narratives. An amazing piece of work that she has put together along with a co-author, Natalia Grincheva, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, is Geopolitics of Digital Heritage, which was published by Cambridge Press in 2024, which explores the political dimensions of large-scale digital heritage platforms. And they've studied the Singapore Memory Project, they've studied Trove, which is based in Australia, and Europeana, and the Google Arts and Culture projects as well. And more recently has been involved in a variety of projects relating to archives, affect, and artificial intelligence tools, along with her collaborator, Devyaditi Roy at the University of Leeds, and Julia Nanke, I think, who's at Hamburg. So Liz, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to this session. Over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you to Venkat for inviting me to speak today. And he's been involved with us as well in the latter project that was mentioned around archives, affect and artificial intelligence, these questions in digital archives. So that's part of a working collaboration that we have going. I'm really pleased to be able to moderate the session today, and to be able to introduce the work of people that are working, perhaps more in the practice around this theme of networks and networks. I think a lot of my work has investigated the intellectual questions, and I guess I'll maybe say more on that and reflect more on that at the end before we open out to questions. But the structure of today is going to be that I'm going to pass over to the panelists to give a short overview of the work that they've been involved in, and perhaps the intellectual questions they're also pursuing within their respective fields. And then we will perhaps I'll ask some questions or try to kind of generate discussion as a result of those presentations, and then we'll open out to questions. And we definitely hope to finish it within the kind of 90-minute mark. So depending on where you are in the world, this session should not be longer than an hour and a half. So that's what we'll do. As I say, the interesting thing about networks, I think people come to this topic differently. And definitely from my perspective, as Venkat mentioned, I come more at it from this field of search and discovery, which is the bringing together of different collections or cultural heritage data through a process that has been known as aggregation, although that term is not always used across different domains in the GLAM sector. So I think that's interesting. I think also the shift away from aggregation, or the term aggregation, is quite interesting. But I won't take up more time now, because I want to pass over to the first presenter, and I will give a short introduction to each presenter before they speak. So the first presenter is Kirsten Arnold. Kirsten is the manager of Archives Portal Europe Foundation. And in this role, Kirsten's responsible for implementing strategic decisions, representing the foundation in various international bodies and working groups, and maintaining and further developing the portal and the network. Alongside this, Kirsten is the chair of the European Aggregators Forum, a network of national, regional, and sector-specific thematic aggregators of cultural heritage data. So I'll pass on to you first, Kirsten, to reflect on this question of the network of networks, this quite evocative title, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you also from my side to Milli Archives Foundation for inviting me today. I have just kind of a few slides that I wanted to share, and of course, I'm now going through this usual process of having to confirm that I want to share, and it doesn't let me for whatever reason. So I won't do any sharing, just to kind of in the interest of time. So as Liz mentioned, I'm from Archives Portal Europe Foundation. We have been developing out of two projects that were initially funded by the European Commission between 2009 and 2012, and then again between 2012 and 15. So that was kind of in a time when, and on the European level, there were quite a few of these aggregation projects going on. So we've got Archives Portal Europe for the archives domain, and then there were kind of different domain and thematic aggregators that were developed in that same context. And the bigger point was Europeana, which is a cross-domain aggregator specifically focused on everything that has been digitized, and that initially kind of developed out of, let's say, trying to set a counterpoint from the European perspective to what Google was doing back then in terms of digitizing lots and lots of books and other types of cultural heritage. So that's kind of to explain a little bit of the background. What we have developed into is a foundation. We are based in the Netherlands, so we are a foundation under Dutch law. And we have kind of, let's say, different levels of networks in our organization. So we have from the foundation side an assembly of associates. So these are still mostly national archives, so coming from those institutions that were originally involved in the projects that created Archives Portal Europe. still supporting us. So they have an annual fee that they are paying, and that's making about, let's say, half to two-thirds of our annual budget, coming from these associate fees. Then we have, with these associates and their organizations, a network of what we call country managers, which is essentially kind of a representative, either an individual person or a team of persons, who are our connectors to the national networks. Because while we are operating on an international level, it's also, of course, good to kind of have someone who can talk to people in their own language, who knows kind of the national landscape of culture heritage, of archiving, the topics that are talked about in the different kind of levels. So we are very lucky that we have this network of kind of supporting characters around us. And then the really wider network is essentially kind of looking at all the institutions that provide content to Archives Portal Europe. We are currently at around 1,300 institutions that we have content of in our portal, and content means digitized material, but also simply metadata. So simply kind of giving people, users, the possibility to know what might be out there, even though they might not be able to kind of directly access the digitized content yet. And I think in terms of further developments or challenges that we see is that in Europe, same as everywhere else, kind of priorities are shifting in terms of where money goes. So I think that's probably something that everyone can relate to. And so we are trying to kind of make use of the network that we have established across the last 15 plus years, to see how can we pool resources in the best way. So how can we use the portal and the technical infrastructure that we have with that as something like kind of a sandbox to maybe also kind of try in smaller projects to develop things that could then be useful for a broader context in the community. And I think with this, I will stop and then we'll see where the conversations go.
Okay, thank you so much, Kirsten. Really interesting to hear about your perspective, I think, from working in the, particularly for me, in the European Aggregators Forum. So I'll pass on now to Jeff Browell and do a short introduction. Jeff Browell is Heritage Collections Lead and the former Head of Archives in the Libraries and Collections team at King's College London. He's responsible for fundraising, promoting the collections, and developing research partnerships within King's and internationally. In addition, Jeff is chair of AIM25, a charitable consortium of more than 150 UK archives and cultural organisations. He's co-founder of X-Archiving, an initiative to standardise and promote the use of extended reality in the GLAM sector and universities. So I'll pass on to Jeff now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll get straight to it as well. I haven't got any slides or anything. So AIM25 stands for Archives in London and the M25 area. For those of you who are not familiar with London, the M25 is the orbital road around London. So the project began around 1998. So we're quite long in the tooth. And we went live in 2000. So we were the fruit of an investment in the UK in the early days of the internet relating to heritage, to GLAM and so forth from the mid-1990s onwards. And we're still going. So we're now up to 150 partners. So the idea was to create an aggregator that would aggregate catalogues of a variety of institutions in the London area. So that's university archives, local authorities, institutional archives belonging to learning societies and medical societies like the Royal Society and the Royal Institution. And then later on, other types of archives joined, museum archives and charitable archives of one kind or another. So we're still open now. We've got 150 members. That's out of about 800 archives that we know about in the London area, of art galleries and a whole variety of different types of organisation. So we've got a long way to go. It's only taken us 26 years to get this far. so I'm not sure I'll see it out. So the whole idea was that we would provide a research tool for the research community, students, academics, and the wider population as well, so local communities. And that's why we developed quite a sophisticated gazetteer of place names of the London area, of collections held in these archives, as well as a powerful subject term index. And a few years after the establishment of the project, we integrated the UK archival thesaurus into our systems. And the UK archival thesaurus is still used today. It's a subject thesaurus, and it's used by the British Library and the Bodleian and other institutions, the Cambridge University Library, to do their archival indexing. And then on top of that, we began to go for fundraising. We became a charity, and we did a lot of work on linked open data and integrating linked open data systems with proprietary software that's used in the sector, like Axial's products, Calm, and so forth. And then later on, extended reality. And then in setting up something called Archives Africa, which was an initiative to assist in the local cataloguing and preservation of archives held in African countries, and to link descriptions held in the UK with descriptions of material held in Africa, as the basis of a sort of digital repatriation program, so that if 50% of our material is held in archives in the UK and 50% is held locally in a country in Africa, it can be reunited. And more importantly, that the experts in both countries begin to talk to one another. So it's a kind of friendship building engine, in other words. So we're very active in fundraising and different projects, especially around artificial intelligence and in the creation of world models, which are the next stage of artificial intelligence involving sophisticated training programs involving video, audio, olfactory, which is smell, and the other senses, which will create a very sophisticated set of models about the world around us, and in our case, looking at heritage. So we have got more than 1,000 years of historical material represented in our collections, but from every corner of the globe. So London has one of the largest concentrations of archives and archival material of any city in the world because of history. The historical situation has resulted in it aggregating in London. And so we are making full use of that. Probably the major thing that we've contributed to, though, is building a community of skills for the archivists in London. Many of our institutions are small, so we have very big ones like the Wellcome Trust, Imperial War Museum, and so on, and major universities. But we also have a lot of archives which, though they only have one member of staff, perhaps one member of staff who works for half a day or 2 days a week, and they need as much support as they can get. And so that's something that we actively try to do. So we hold sessions in person 3 times a year. We have training opportunities, and we like to get those archivists involved in our funding applications to develop new technologies to spread the word about archives, and also to connect with the other aspects of GLAM, of the galleries, libraries, archives, and museum world. So I'll leave it there, but I'm sure I'll have something to contribute in the next section.
Okay, so thanks so much, Jeff, and I'll move on now to presenting the final speaker. This is James Nye. So James Nye is Director of the Digital South Asia Library and formerly the Bibliographer for South Asia at the University of Chicago. Recent funded projects he's been involved in include dictionaries for South Asian languages, documenting sonic and visual South Asia, and working with the Huntington Photographic Archive of Buddhist and Asian art.
Thanks very much, Liz, and special thanks to you, Venkat, for putting together Milli Archives first, and also for assembling the event today. I'm deeply appreciative having been invited. Let me begin by saying that networks and networking has been fundamental to the 3.5 decades that I spent at the University of Chicago, engaging with both libraries and archives. And Liz, as you had identified it, I like to think of three different categories or types of resources that have been the focus of my activities. First of those is texts, then second is images, and third is sound recordings. Within this category of texts, I'm especially pleased that we've done as much as we have with lexical resources for understanding South Asia. And extending out on that starting point with texts, we've just recently, within the last year, begun an initiative that's addressing textual resources for understanding what are endangered languages of South Asia. In the category of images, I've been especially pleased to see that we're moving along with an archive collection of about 250,000 photographs related to Buddhism and the Buddhist tradition, uh, both South Asia and all the way to East Asia. It's the Huntington Archive that is being incorporated into the University of Chicago's system for presentation. And as another example of images and imagery, we've recently completed the scanning of some of the earliest Survey of India maps. Those should be available in the fairly near term. Those are the amazingly interesting 1 inch to the mile sheets. So it's going to provide a new take on what it is that was happening on the ground, if you will, cartographically represented in South Asia up until the time of independence. Switching to the last of those three areas, that is sound recordings, we've just recently made available once again, after a hiatus due to a server failure, the Linguistic Survey of India's gramophone recordings. Some of you will know that there were 252 gramophone recordings recorded as part of the Linguistic Survey of India activities in the early 20th century. Those are available often with transcriptions. They come from a particular form of networks and networking, since that involved a deep collaboration with the British Library, the place that held in its sound collection these 252 very rare gramophone recordings. And extending out from that into the world of the sonic world, we're just now returning to an initiative with EMI archives located in England. And the intention is to make available at a beginning point the both the catalogs and also the release sheets that were produced by HMV, the gramophone company. So those are a few of the types described of activities that I've been involved in. Thinking about the specific topic of networks and networking, one of the things that gives me enormous pride is the way in which we've gone about working with colleagues in South Asia. Some of you will know that the Rojamuttaya Research Library was developed largely through a collaboration between colleagues who are in Chennai and the University of Chicago. The arrangement was that we would purchase the collection, we would pay for all of the activities related to the staffing and documentation of this archival collection, beginning with about 50,000 published materials. And then after a period of time, we would turn over the ownership in its entirety to our colleagues at the Rojamuttaya Research Library. It's a system or an approach that we've replicated now a few times. jocularly referred to it as a catch and release program. In other words, we weren't interested in taking the collection out of South Asia where it properly resides, but instead help to make it possible for this to be opened out for use by people in South Asia and also elsewhere in the world. And then last of the initiatives I'd like to point to is what we call the South Asia Open Archives. Now about 10 years going. It's a consortium that involves collaboration between about 24 international research libraries and archives. The intention is to open up free access to a multidisciplinary digital collection of primary resource materials. And that has been focused on rare historical and contemporary records that are made available to worldwide researchers. So finally, I'd like to comment a bit on a new experiment that I've recently gotten involved in, which presents challenges and problems of a sort that I think many of you will have experienced yourself. This has to do with artificial intelligence and textual corpora. Of course, many of you know that this has been a dramatically expanding field with enormous successes over the course of the last months, especially. What I'm thinking about is an approach that would address the entire life cycle of textual materials, archival and non-archival. It starts with the creation through optical character recognition of both printed texts and manuscripts, both OCR areas, ones that are just producing enormously good results recently. Second, one of the intentions is to restructure those digital texts in a way that makes them more useful in collaborative ways with other texts and with other groups of people and their texts. A third area is modeling semantic change within this network of textual corpora. And finally, exploring ways that the texts can be used to understand the history of ideas. Now, the biggest flaw, the biggest problem, and I think many of you will appreciate this as participants of Milli institutions, we have a horrible dearth, a shortage of materials that are in digital form and that can be used for experimentation and also for interconnecting. That challenge, that flaw that we're facing is one that I hope we can pull together and address collectively. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much to everyone who's presented for just offering your different perspectives and sharing in the work that you've been doing. As I say, regarding the theme of networks is a very broad theme, and I myself, I think, come to this theme, as I mentioned at the start, more from the perspective of large-scale digital heritage aggregation, and my work has been quite focused on the sort of, I suppose, originally in my doctoral studies, in the sort of the political imperatives that could be folded into technical projects like this one. But then as time has gone on with the postdoctoral projects that I've done, and then making connections between big transnational projects like Europeana to more sort of nationally based projects like Trove in my postdoctoral work, I've sort of become increasingly interested in how these projects have developed over time. And also, I think Kirsten mentioned the funding challenges that kind of, I think do kind of follow most of these projects around in one form or another. And the idea of sort of housing them over time, or finding a home for them over time, I think is quite an interesting one, unless they're based in a kind of specific institution. So, for example, Trove is an aggregator that's hosted by the National Library of Australia. Sometimes it can be difficult to sort of think about how these projects sustain themselves. And I think what we've heard from the presenters today are kind of really interesting ways in which those kind of things can happen. I think very much through the creation of things like consortia and foundations. The idea that the network goes beyond just the technical infrastructure, although interestingly, I do think infrastructure is a word that's more in the foreground now with a lot of these projects. They are being funded using infrastructure funding, I think now, a lot of the time. But also how it is a way of bringing together different communities and skill building. So I think that was really interesting. I think in Jeff's presentation, for example, you mentioned with AIM25, sort of 3 different areas. So this kind of community of skills, but being able to connect archivists through the consortium, the connections between materials which are geographically distant from one another, and then also being able to experiment with the next generation of tools, which is something that was also I noted and was identified by James and Kirsten in their presentations as well. So definitely, I don't know whether that's it's definitely something of interest to me, because I think everyone's sort of mentioning AI tools now and how they can be used. And I've definitely come across interesting approaches as well. A colleague working with something called AI vector databases, so finding different ways of being able to draw connections between collections now, which I found particularly interesting. So not just based on structured metadata and those kinds of descriptive metadata terms, but between the size of objects or the dimensions of objects, being able to, AI tools being used to make connections between collections in that way, perhaps with material or objects, especially in the museum context, that may have been misidentified historically. So there's all this kind of interesting stuff. So I suppose what I wanted to ask, if the presenters are willing to reflect on, in that question of how do you see maybe the experimental work that's enabled by the kind of networks that you're all involved in, and working with AI tools, I guess, is a big part of that, something you've all mentioned. How do you see that as part of the future of what you do? Maybe just, it's an invitation really, perhaps, to just say a bit more about that. If I don't know who wants to begin.
I mean, for AIM25, we're involved. I think the fact that we have a certain institutional status, so we're a charitable incorporated organization, which means that we're part business and we're part charity. And we were founded in King's College London. So there is an academic lead that enables us to apply for Research Council funding and Horizon funding and other international funding as a partner of one description or another. So we can act on behalf of the other members, even if they're not from that institutional background. So I think that's an important starting point, whether we're able to do that or not. And I think it is with all these things, if we're not moving forward, we're going backwards. So I think there's no such thing as an archive that's never used is one that is doomed to disappear. So we need to find new ways of accessing and connecting stuff. So for our linked open data projects, we didn't just want to create semantic enhancement of the catalogs. We wanted to experiment with the data of digitized material, the primary source data. And then we wanted to connect various communities of interest who supercharged and enhanced the semantic connections that we found. So if it was a series of collections about the Second World War, you might want to get Second World War experts, lay experts or other experts, people who are experts on a particular aspect of it, to add their comments, to add their rich understanding to the metadata to create a richer sort of paradata. And so in doing so, we're creating new links between people. So what we've discovered is that in those situations, often the original archives and what they contain are less important than the new friendships which are forged between people. So that you might end up with an expert on brain surgery talking to somebody who knows how to build cars, who's talking to somebody who's an expert on furniture and the history of furniture. And then you end up with wholly new sets and classes of information being created and new projects that are being spawned from it. So it becomes a kind of project aggregator as well as an aggregator of archives.
Okay, thank you. And James, you were going to say something, I think.
Yeah, federated discovery is one of those things that I think is just absolutely essential if we're going to move forward as a group of archives, libraries, and try to do serious work together. And here, Kirsten, I was so taken by your engagement with Europeana and thinking about a parallel body, the Digital Public Library of America. These are organizations that really help to facilitate that exploration that cuts across institutions or silos of information. And of course, the prerequisite for any success is that there has to be good metadata describing what's in the collections. And then further, and ideally, the objects that one finds through the metadata should increasingly be available in a form that could be interconnected in the ways that I think you're describing, Liz and Jeff. That is, they should be operational with computational tools. And I'd be interested to hear more from you, Kirsten, about what exactly has been going forward and what the next steps are for Europeana, thinking about federated discovery of more resources that are in this powerful network.
Yeah, maybe if I can pick up on this aspect of federation, because so the next step in the context of Europeana, but also kind of the aggregation landscape that has developed around it on the European level, is what the European Commission calls data spaces. So this is kind of the next thing, so to say, from the website to the portal to the infrastructure to the data space as kind of the big connector that brings together things on different levels. And there are currently 14 in total, so also different industry areas like transport and health are supposed to kind of establish their own data spaces. It also goes a little bit hand in hand with kind of trying to become more independent from the big tech in the US and kind of establishing more European solutions to some extent. But in this context, there's currently a big conversation going on with regard to federation versus centralization, because the way that we have been doing aggregation in the last 15 to 20 years is essentially that we are moving the same data from one place to another to potentially another, doing a little bit of kind of transformation along the side, standardizing the data, extending it with linked open data, URIs and references to make those connections to kind of increase discoverability, interoperability, linkability. But that also comes with the drawback of you always have to try to keep things up to date. And that is essentially kind of a race where you're always behind. Because the institution locally will have updated the data already once you have it in your aggregation service. And I think that's one thing where also Liz mentioned that earlier, this term of aggregation is now being looked at differently, and we are more talking about data sharing and also data sharing at source, which comes with its own kind of challenges, because that means that we also need to make sure that the individual institutions that share their data are put in the position to do so on their own, so to say. And that comes back to this networking aspect and making sure that we can learn from each other, we can exchange experiences, expertise, ideas, knowledge, tools that we implement on that. So yeah, there's kind of a dichotomy at the moment between these two lines of thoughts, and there's no clear direction yet in terms of how this will go, but I think it's just good to kind of have those conversations and see what could work out in the best way.
Yeah. It's so interesting to hear about those conversations. It's something you can, I mean, and also from looking at it from a kind of academic perspective, you can read that into the shift in the policy narrative for sure. I think some of the things that you've been saying, It's very interesting to me, actually, the move potentially away from something like the European data model, where you're trying to establish minimum standards of compatibility for data to be harvested, towards, like you say, maybe being able to do data sharing where that requirement is not there, perhaps in the same way. And I know that definitely mirrors the kind of approach of some UK-based initiatives. I've got a colleague that works at the Museum Data Service, where they definitely conceptualize. They're a kind of UK-based aggregator for museum collections, but definitely they're trying to get people involved, and understanding the kind of baseline is that not all institutions are going to have the funding to be able to maintain this kind of resource-intensive collections data. So any model for sharing is much more based on meeting those institutions where they are. And it's almost, I think, it's definitely being envisaged more of an infrastructure, much more in the background, like not trying to replicate the work of a museum or a gallery or an archive by doing an exhibition, that kind of public outreach side as much. It's much more in the background, and creating a data framework for the institution to support the institution. And I don't know whether that is also the same with the European data spaces idea, but it seems, from what I can kind of understand through reading it, to mirror some of that idea. And definitely, as you said, the shift towards talking about infrastructure and infrastructure funding for those kinds of initiatives as well.
I think with a lot of archivists are quite reticent about their professional skills. And therefore within institutions, they don't necessarily make their voices heard sufficiently. And that results in other people not taking archives and the contents of archives seriously. So if the people who actually curate archives aren't putting a good enough case forward for a variety of reasons, then they can't really expect the powers that be within their organizations to do the same. I mean, AIM 25 is a great mix of different bodies. Some are archives, so that's all they do, the institution. In other cases, they're a GLAM organization with an archive, so they have other objectives from an institutional point of view, running a museum, having visitors, having school children, developing exhibitions. And in some cases, they're not GLAM organizations at all. For example, local government bodies which are tasked with cleaning refuse or managing the roads or other kinds of activities, in which case the heritage component is very, very low down on the list of what's important. And even within a university, the IT department here manages more than 200 applications of one kind or another. Most of them, or many of them, are business critical, like email, the website, big research platforms and so on that are needed. And so even with very rich and important collections, with the best will in the world, our activities are way down the list of priorities. And this highlights the fact that there is, broadly speaking, a lack of IT support, development support within the sector. It tends to be a few individuals or a small community of people who are expert in working with our types of data and bringing our stories to the forefront. And there isn't necessarily a kind of professional continuity of that. And that makes it very difficult for digital projects to succeed in the long term. They tend to have a life of 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And then the data will disappear. Digitization projects, especially, because long-term preservation hasn't been thought through. And so the data just disappears. Unless it's name rich and it's ended up as part of a big repository, the Archaeology Data Service in the UK. It's a case in point.
I have a question for all three of my colleagues here, as well as for Venkat, if you want to join in. And that has to do with the question of sharing resources. For the longest time, in my engagements with people in South Asia archives, there was a sense that archival material should not be shared because that deprecates the likelihood of people actually coming to use the archives in person. I have a sense that that's waning as a consideration, particularly in the South Asia subcontinent. but it's still there, and one hears these arguments from national archives as well as state archives and smaller archives. I'm wondering to what extent you're experiencing this as um, a contravailing force when it comes to opening and sharing resources, and what kinds of arguments you've mustered that have been effective in trying to counter what I see as a retrograde kind of approach to archives and effectively keeping them uh, as a dragon's lair surrounded by protective armament.
Yeah, maybe I can start us off with a little bit of the experiences that we had in our context, also kind of thinking back of the first conversations that we had in the project times, because the first project was really just kind of National Archives, so more seen as a pilot phase to see what would we need to do in order to bring things together. But then in the second project phase, we extended that to other types of archival institutions. So on the administrative side, going to the regional and local levels, but also kind of including university archives, church archives, archives from media institutions, some business archives. So spreading this a little bit. And of course, each type of archival institution, also as Geoff was saying, is has kind of a slightly different reason for doing these things. And I think this aspect of, let's say, audience engagement is certainly something that we've also had. So kind of, yeah, we want to kind of still make sure that people are coming here and looking at the original documents. I think that was kind of at the very beginnings when also institutions didn't have that much digitized. There was also kind of an argument, but I think the stronger arguments that we had heard was more kind of this thing of um, our descriptions are not good enough yet. And I think that is kind of also a narrative that we have seen evolve as technology evolved, so that people seem to be feeling more comfortable with putting something online, putting something out there that only is kind of, for example, description on collection level, or kind of the other way around, kind of just starting with digitized material, even if the metadata doesn't exist yet. But kind of at least making sure that they are seen and their collections are seen, I think is a big driver in terms of being connected to initiatives like Archives Portal Europe and or Europeana and similar things. So this thing of getting people physically into the archive seems to be a little bit on stepping back. At least that's been my experiences throughout the last few years. But yeah, interested to hear what Liz and Geoff think.
I think in the case of, I mean, I ran a specialist repository. And so when digitization first came in, we were experiencing a huge uptick in the number of physical visits as well, because people were becoming aware of what we held in a much more immediate way. With other types of repository, it's been the other way down. So with National Archives material that's very name rich, material that has ended up on ancestry.com or newspaper archives, then that means that there are fewer in-person visits. And part of the problem is that the archive sector has been very bad at measuring impact. So of the bits of GLAM, it's worst at it for a variety of reasons, legitimate reasons. For example, an art gallery or a museum, you know how many people are coming to visit your museum. You can sit there with your clicker and you can work it out if you want to go down that route. And with libraries, it's possible to look at the number of views of digitized books, for example, and visitors in person. With archives, measuring real value is a lot more difficult, and there have been a number of attempts to do this, and none of them have really succeeded. You know, is one archive visitor worth 1,000 library visitors, for example, because of the value of the work that they do? So it's really attempting to measure things that are very difficult to measure. And until we can do that more effectively and do it horizontally across institutions and vertically alongside other kinds of heritage or memory institutions, then we aren't going to be able to advocate for archives effectively.
Yeah, I can see that and just thinking very practically, like you've sort of gestured towards it there, that there are not always item level descriptions for things. Things might be at box level, which goes back to the archival researcher coming in and actually being able to bring that to life in a way through the research that they do often. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, trying to think through trying to think all through the different dimensions of this. I suppose one thing that I was thinking about was, I suppose, to do with the way that attitudes towards this might have shifted. I think what you said earlier, Jeff, about an archive that's not used is sort of that's the death of the archive in a way, and maybe the question of like making people aware and raising awareness is integral in that sense, even though it may in the archival context not always be a simple thing of making something available online that leads to higher engagement. It did remind me when you talked about ancestry that one of the reasons for very high engagement with the national level aggregator Trove is that people were using it for family history research because it was an aggregator, but it also did hold and make available freely at one point digitized newspaper records. So people were able to search that digitized content for names of family members and things like that. So I do think there's something quite interesting about how content is made available through these kinds of systems as well, and then what kind of engagement that can lead to. So it's something like Ancestry is behind a paywall, but Trove had high user engagement because at that point those digitized newspaper archives were not behind a paywall. So it really spawned a community of researchers that helped each other out and with sort of family history queries and things like that of how to use those collections. So yeah, I can sort of see it's a kind of case, an example of how I guess you would call archival material, newspaper archival material can be made, can lead to higher engagement as well. I wonder, going back to James's original question, I would be interested to hear Venkat's perspective, because I thought that it was interesting to hear that there was a period when there was not an interest in sharing, and you know how far that still persists, because I can totally understand that in different archival contexts this question may be understood differently.
Thanks. I'll give it a shot. I cannot speak for many archives broadly, and I'm not sure about the historical context. My sense from my limited perspective is that I think there is quite a bit of interest in getting archival material visible to the public. There has been, of course, through the networks that we've been developing, through sharing of resources. There are two very different kinds of issues that I see. One is, of course, just nuts and bolts of how rigorous or how complete is a catalog to be made visible. You know, what Kirsten said, that people sometimes may say that we don't have enough description, but it might be that the catalog or the formats in which it exists are not, they don't have the right bridge to make it visible in a network, so to speak. So very often, I think, at least the few problems that we've seen are just largely the catalogs exist, but in a language that is not easily translatable. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done in fixing that. So that's a technical sort of hurdle in this limited space. But the other end of this question, I'd sort of shared a link. We discussed quite a bit of reusability, accessibility, interoperability. This questions of data governance and sovereignty obviously start to come up more and more with these digital tools. And I'm not sure if that was something that you were alluding to, Jim. There might well be situations where people don't want to make their data public or visible through a network, because then there is very little control on how it gets to be effectively reused and perhaps misused. I'm not sure if that's the direction that we want to take this conversation in, but I'm curious to see, especially in sort of the asymmetry of where knowledge comes from and where knowledge resides and where knowledge gets used. And that That's something that I think we've experienced. And of course, we'd love to hear from other people in the audience or members of the network. While I'm standing at the podium, I mean, Jeff did mention this question about how do you measure success or how do you measure archives? And so that's one of the reasons why we've been trying to do this open access tool of, trying to set up very basic questions of an archive health tool. At least in these spaces, we've been thinking of archives as being part of the digital commons. And in a very romantic way, the question then is, how do you measure the quality of something that's the commons? How do you truly think about the place of the archive? And so those have been sort of the motivating questions for us in developing this first phase of the archive health tool. Yeah, maybe we'll have some answers in a year.
I think increasingly it's about moving away from our traditional audiences. I mean, we're still very attuned to our audiences, researchers, students, people of that kind. People who are interested in history from in an amateur sort of way, towards other questions like digital citizenship. And so the use of archives to build social cohesion, social prescribing, which is where doctors prescribe visits to archives or museums instead of antidepressants, for example. And the world problem approach to heritage stuff, which is, can we contribute to projects that are about solving or helping to solve big global issues and problems? An example would be our collections that are 40 years worth of drugs trials for pharmaceuticals, which were deemed to be unimportant to begin with, but which now can be reanalyzed to find clues to the creation of new drugs. So that's all stuff that's held within archives which were deemed to be unimportant originally. So I think some of those objectives can help build fresh cases for the value of archives.
Thank you. Does anybody from the panel want to say anything before? I was just wanting to leave a little bit of time to open out to our audience and to questions. So if anyone wants to make, Kirsten or James, to make closing remarks.
Just a very quick response to your comments, Venkat. I think it's critically important that we need to work closely with those people responsible for the archives and keep them empowered to make the decisions as to which things are appropriate to make available in a discoverable fashion and which things, according to their sense, need to be retained, locked down, and treated in a different fashion. But more broadly, I think a sense of empowering the heads of archives to feel comfortable making those decisions is really critically important. And that would go a long way, I think, toward elevating the status, the appreciation of archivists in the larger world of information and information flow.
Yeah, and maybe just connecting this back to something that I think Jeff said earlier, and that brings us also back to this networks idea. I think it's not only about kind of making archives important again or connected again to other areas of life, so to say, but it's also kind of this point of really bringing different perspectives into the game of making archives available, so that it's not only the archivists talking about and thinking about how do we put our stuff online, but that this includes kind of the researchers, or includes the local communities, or includes developers, data scientists, if we're going back to the AI point that we were trying to make earlier. So kind of really building on these different perspectives and not seeing them as a threat to what archives have been doing for hundreds of years, I think is an important aspect of that networking and making things work in an online environment.
Thank you. I think that's so true. I think all of you in different ways are sort of touching on that when thinking about the community of people involved in this work. And yeah, I think it's a great point in which to end, and it definitely gives me food to thought to think about, so what does search and discovery look like reimagined when you bring many, many more people into that equation of thinking about how to make things available, or how to create connections between collections. Yeah, something definitely to think more about. So now I think if we have a little bit of time, and if anybody wanted to ask questions or just has a specific question perhaps for one of the presenters based on the discussion today, I want to open it out now, but I'll also ask for help from my co-hosts online in identifying people who may want to speak. Also, if people want to put any comments in the chat, we can sort of respond to those as well. Okay. Okay, that's interesting to talk about, to see Jeff's comment about not, in a sense, distancing yourself from the term archivist. Yeah, maybe it's not easy for everybody to understand what that involves. I think I definitely have that problem as well when people ask me what I research. So
ask whether I've got something to do with Indiana Jones. They confuse archivists with archaeologists. So not really, no.
Yeah, very glamorous. So I can't see anyone with a hand up, but there is a question that's come into the chat now. Yeah. Which is, can an archive success matrix be tracked through the number of access requests that an archive receives? That's a question about this kind of, I guess, criteria for success that we touched on in the panel discussion. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, and we are having those conversations as well in our context, because being completely digital in terms of our service, of course, this whole question of views and users and unique users and all these kind of typical stats that you would have for a website have also been part of kind of our internal reporting to some extent. Although we are now also kind of rethinking that and kind of really asking the question, is this really kind of the measures that we want to put down? And that maybe connecting that a little bit to kind of this question of use and reuse, and getting a better understanding of what do people actually get out of the resources that they find on our service, or when they are kind of pointed back to the archival institution who has initially provided the material, is, I think, the more interesting part, because it goes more into the quality of interaction than just kind of counting numbers. But that's, yeah, just kind of the conversation that we are having at the moment.
Yeah, I've definitely had the experience of interviewing people involved with projects. I think it was an interview with some of the staff at Digital Public Library of America. That was back in 2017, who were definitely kind of wrangling with the same question in terms of how you measure how people are using the service based on clicks. Like, that's very difficult, and it's very difficult also to quantify success through that metric. So it's interesting, isn't it? Because perhaps going back to Romella's question, that you can document something, and maybe it's important to sort of to start that work thinking about what Venkat was saying as well, like maybe you need to start documenting that work. And I feel like at the beginning, when you were talking about the evaluation, self-evaluation, that initiative that you're kind of promoting at the moment, there is work to be done to kind of self-evaluate and document and keep track of these things in some way. But I always think it's also about how you measure success generally, in terms of, is it like you said, I think that goes to what you were saying, Kirsten, like, is it about just some kind of engagement or interaction, or is it about actually the quality of that, and how do you develop that, how do you promote that side of things? Yeah, I think it's a good question. Okay, so I'll just see.
Maybe I could jump in just quickly to say, in addition to clicks and response to requests, it seems to me that something that's more qualitative, such as the amount of time someone spends in an archive as a researcher, keeping track of um, those elements that have to do with the depth of engagement are really important too in understanding the significance of a collection and what it's offering to the users.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Duration is so much more important when I guess you're thinking about digital archives as well. So there's a couple more questions come in. One from Maya of the Milli Archives Foundation. So Maya says she's mentioning digital corpora here. So she's sort of saying that these are public goods too. So in an age of AI where all data is fair game as raw material, how can archives be center stage in processes of verification to make analog archives great again? This is
Well,
this is a great question.
I've often thought that with essentially what archives, I put a project proposal through about 8 years ago and it didn't get funding. And that was to create a tool that would allow verification using archives for journalists. And it's kind of been superseded now, that technology and approach. But people look to the archivist and archives as a sort of record of last resort in a world of misinformation and deep fakes. So if you have an original of a photograph, then it might be really the only authentic copy of something. It isn't necessarily authentic when we get it, when we receive it. It might have been manipulated 50 or 100 years ago. But as far as we can tell, it's the best shot that we've got in terms of saying that is the original photograph. That's how people appeared in the photograph. It hasn't been doctored in any way. And so it means that the work of archivists and the trust, which is the key thing, people trust curators, generally speaking, much more highly than they do many other professions if they know anything about them. And so we can utilize that trust by saying that we hold a record that is the record that people will go to actually determine whether something is true or authentic or not, on a spectrum, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. James, did you want to say something? I know you work with corpora, and so.
Well, yeah, actually, I was getting ready for a shout out to Milli Archives. In terms of making analog archives great again, it seems to me that this is a stroke of genius. And continuing to pursue in a really vigorous way, as you have, those interconnections between archives seems just exactly right, the right kind of move to be making in India, and I'd say more generally in South Asia right now.
Do you want to comment, Venkat, at all on this question?
Given that the questions from my colleague Maya, I'm going to cede the ground to her. But thanks for the shout out, Jim. I had a question myself, but I think there's a question in the audience first. So maybe
there's another question in the chat, and then we can go to yours, Venkat. So the question from Sadiq is, how do we approach or study audiovisual archival material from the past, from the post-colonial lens? Do we apply a contextual study to critically understand its origin, format, and content? What is the methodology to study such cases? That's a very interesting question. I don't know. James, I know you're working on audiovisual stuff, and I guess Jeff, working from London and London Archives, there's maybe some of those questions as well, but I'll let you.
Well, the most important, I suppose, the most obvious response to that is to say that the historical collections often enough were built under colonial control. And one needs to be engaged in historiographical kinds of critiquing of what's gone on in the composition of those archives. So if I go back to the audiovisual materials that were collected as part of the Linguistic Survey of India, it's striking in two ways to me. Number one, there's a statement that's included in the printed volumes of the Linguistic Survey that there is no anticipation on the part of those compiling the audio recordings that they will ever be of interest to anyone in India. And as a consequence, all of the copies were distributed to Europe, particularly to Scotland, Ireland, and to England, which is just downright egregious. But it's an example of the kind of misinterpretation of context that's important to be cognizant of all of the time. And the same is true of visual resources. Often enough, those were compiled by colonial administrators. Although pleasingly, I have to say that there's a fantastic collection of the audio, of the visual resources, maybe the best in the country, that's at the Ibrahim Al-Qazi collection in Delhi, where the work of amateur photographers and others has been brought together in a way that's often a powerful counterpoint to the colonial perspective.
I would say I can't really add anything to what James has said. He's the real expert in this area, except to say that there are a number of pan-European projects which seek to reevaluate cataloguing of colonial subjects and colonial era material, especially photographs, but also other types of description, in order to give a different lens, a different set of perspectives from the originators of the material, but also the first people to catalogue the material who may have lived 100 years ago themselves. So I think there is a lot of work in this area that is very fruitful. Again, to really shout out to Venkat and his team is all the tremendous work that you've been doing. And I know how difficult it is because I've run AIM25 for many, many years, and that's just London, which is not very big by comparison with the whole of India. I would say that there is a real appetite here in the UK, and especially in London, to connect our archives with archives held in India, and to connect the descriptions and to connect the actual archives and the people that work with them, whether they're expert or whether they're lay people or whether they're local people or people who live internationally in a diaspora. So if there are projects or there are initiatives and people want to do that, make those connections, let's go for it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Well, I think perhaps we should move towards kind of closing off the session now. So I've got, maybe I can pass to, perhaps I can pass to Venkat to sort of, for maybe if you want to have the final question, but also to connect to the question that Jaya's asked about tips to convince public archives, how to convince them to join archival networks to make their archival sources more visible. Obviously, I guess pointing towards what's already been highlighted here, that in the context of India, this is very important work, trying to kind of establish a network of networks. Milli Archives Foundation is kind of integral to that, I think. So I don't know if that connects at all to your question, Venkat, but we could pair them up, and I could also give the floor back to you for the ending.
Sure. It actually does connect a bit, and I wanted to ask all of the panelists here, just some piece of advice. The idea of having archive networks assumes that there is a set of archives that want to make their data visible. I mean, so I'm just saying there are so many steps that go into this process, and if you have any comments on where the state is in all of this, whether it's the local government or the national government in the networks that you have developed, what is the state's sort of motivation? And I think this sort of ties to Jaya's question also about public archives. So I just wanted to sort of get a sense from all of you to say at what, because I mean, the state offering a service is something that is for the people, and you'd imagine that you see networks and archive catalogs as being a need to have. So I'm just curious to know, how do you get to a point where it's not nice to have, but a need? Yeah, I don't know if anybody has any thoughts.
I'm going to say historically, archives have survived where they have a deeper purpose, or where they're connected with institutions that have a longer lifespan, and there's a deeper meaning, whether they're religious organizations or whether there are other similar types of organization where people are invested in them. Whereas archives of many other sorts of institutions may only last 50, 20, 50, 100 years because those institutions have a very limited lifespan. That doesn't really answer your question, but it's a comment.
Personally, I have allergy to government institutions anywhere, but that's a bullshit perspective. Let me take a different tack, though, on a suggestion for Milli that you may want to consider, and that has to do with a fellowship program where you could bring new people from would-be archives or folks who are younger practitioners in archives into a residency program, let's say for 3 months or a half year, working shoulder to shoulder with you all in Bangalore in an effort to both build further expertise, but also to share perspectives in ways that I think could be really productive for either the nascent archives or the archives that are in early stages of development.
I think also to maybe have, we've done it over here where we have sessions and projects that connect small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, with archives and archive content to solve particular problems. And then you get a range of people interested in joining the profession who are not traditional people, the people who are interested in broader storytelling, artificial intelligence, or they are committed to social good in some way. They recognize the value of archives socially and in terms of rebuilding communities. So you have a range of different types of people, and it's introducing those to your archives. And I think the proposal that James just put forward would be an admirable one in that regard.
Kirsten, did you want to say?
Yeah, maybe just kind of adding from what I've seen in different European countries in terms of the impact that a state level decision can have on things. So we do have some examples where, for example, digitization throughout a certain period of time was very much, or funding for digitization was very much kind of connected to you then also have to make sure that this is published specifically in national level aggregators. So there was a direct connection being made between digitization funding and making it available in a broader context. So not only kind of doing it for your own institution or maybe publishing on your own institution's website, but really kind of already thinking about this networking aspect. This has gone back a little bit because in general funding for digitization has gone back, even though there's still a lot that needs to be digitized. But that's at least kind of one experience that I wanted to share in this context, that there is kind of a trickle-on aspect, so to say, sometimes from directions that are taking on a state level.
Thank you. So I think maybe we'll close the session there then. And there are a couple of really good points as well, questions, I guess, like about the value of archives. I think it, in a sense, reinforces what people have been saying about, getting people to take ownership of archives, and just saying that the value of archives should be highlighted to the public, who are sort of the stakeholders in it. I think that's important, and there is a question. There's lots of interesting sort of avenues you could sort of take with that in terms of state intervention or not. But how you get people to take ownership is a great question, and one that I do think we've circled around quite a lot today. But I think I wanted to pass it back then to Venkat, perhaps just to close off and say thank you once again for organising this and for bringing us together today.
Really, thanks so much, Liz. Thanks for moderating this conversation. It was to Jim, Kirsten, and Jeff. Thanks as always for joining us in these discussions. Our audience was quite varied. There were many people from across India and South Asia, where we're hoping that we'll keep strengthening and developing networks. And of course, it'll be nice, as Jeff said, to be able to actually sort of speak between these networks. So that's why this motivation to think of networks of networks. The idea for this largely came about from the the 1940s paper, which sort of I think was there in the abstract for this particular talk by I think Solon Buck, where they did have, there's an article which is in the public domain that people can read called sort of One World of thinking of archives that can actually speak to each other. And, 80 years on, we are sort of getting to a point where we're starting to sort of think about these ideas. And, hopefully this will actually come to realization somewhere. So on that note, thanks again to all the visitors, all the people who participated in the conversation. And we'll stick around for those who have a few more questions that we can answer. Especially, I noticed a few questions around resources for archives, archival material in India. So if we know something, we'd be happy to answer that. So I will thank you all again, and I'll stop the recording here.